Unit 7031 staff called him the scientific devil, a man so cold-blooded that even his fellow war criminals were horrified by what he did. His name was Yoshimura. He was a respected physiologist from Kyoto Imperial University, and for 7 years, he froze human beings alive to study frostbite. He tested on children as young as 3 days old. He dipped a baby's fingers in ice water just to record how long it took to freeze. He froze limbs until they were black and solid, then struck them with sticks to hear them sound like wood. And after the war, he became a university president. He won Japan's highest honor from the emperor. He never faced trial. This is the story of the man who turned human suffering into science. Winter 1943. Bingifă, Manchuria. The temperature outside was minus 40 degrees Celsius. Inside one of Unit 731's laboratories, a group of Chinese prisoners stood barefoot in a courtyard, their hands and arms submerged in tubs of ice water. Yoshimura Hisato stood nearby with a stopwatch, clipboard in hand. He wasn't there to help them. He was timing them, watching, waiting for the exact moment when human tissue would freeze solid. After 20 minutes, he ordered his assistants to remove the prisoners' arms from the water. The skin was blue-white. Ice crystals had formed over the surface. Yoshimura walked up to the first prisoner and struck his frozen arm with a short wooden stick. It made a sound like hitting a plank of wood. He nodded with satisfaction. The experiment was working. He ordered different treatments for each prisoner. Some would have their frozen limbs doused with scalding hot water. Others would be held over open flames. A few would simply be left untreated overnight to see how long it would take for their own blood to thaw the frozen tissue. None of them would survive. But Yoshimura would get his data, and that was all that mattered. To understand how a respected scientist became one of history's most brutal experimenters, we need to go back to his beginnings. Yoshimura Hisato was born in Japan in the early 1900s. Unlike many military personnel who came from humble backgrounds, Yoshimura was educated at one of Japan's most prestigious institutions, Kyoto Imperial University. He studied medicine and specialized in physiologies, the science of how living organisms function. By the 1930s, Yoshimura had established himself as a promising young researcher. He was intelligent, methodical, and deeply interested in how the human body adapted to extreme environments. His early work focused on environmental physiologists studying how humans responded to cold, heat, altitude, and other challenging conditions. He became a lecturer at Kyoto Imperial University's Faculty of Medicine. He had a promising academic career ahead of him. He was respected by his peers. He published papers in medical journals. He had a family. On the surface, he was a normal, successful professional. But in 1938, everything changed. Japan's military expansion into China was accelerating. The Imperial Japanese Army needed solutions to practical problems their soldiers were facing on the battlefield. One of the most pressing issues was frostbite. Japanese soldiers fighting in the freezing winters of Manchuria and northern China were suffering devastating frostbite injuries. Entire units were being rendered combat ineffective because soldiers' hands and feet were freezing. The military needed to understand exactly how frostbite occurred, how to prevent it, and how to treat it once it happened. They needed data. Real data. Not from textbooks or animal experiments, but from actual human subjects exposed to real freezing conditions. And they knew exactly who to ask. Unit 731, under the command of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, was actively recruiting scientists from Japan's top universities. Ishii specifically wanted researchers who were willing to push ethical boundaries in the name of military necessity. He promised them unlimited funding, state-of-the-art facilities, and complete freedom to conduct whatever experiments they deemed necessary. For Yoshimura, the opportunity was irresistible. Here was a chance to conduct research that would be impossible anywhere else. He would have access to human test subjects, something no civilian researcher could ever obtain legally. He would have no ethical oversight, no review boards, no restrictions. His university superiors encouraged him to go. They saw it as a patriotic duty. Professor Shosei, one of Yoshimura's men, actively sent his students and colleagues to Unit 731, viewing it as an opportunity for advancement and groundbreaking research. In 1938, Yoshimura arrived at Unit 731's massive complex in Ping. He was commissioned as an army engineer, a special designation for civilian researchers working for the military. He was given his own laboratory, staff, and an unlimited budget. His official mission was to develop methods to prevent and treat cold injuries in Japanese soldiers. His actual role would become far darker. Unlike some of the other researchers at Unit 731, who rotated between different types of experiments, Yoshimura had a singular focus: hypothermia and frostbite. He would spend the next 7 years obsessively studying the effects of freezing temperatures on human tissue, and he would use thousands of living human beings to do it. Yoshimura set up what he called the low-temperature physiology laboratory within Unit 731. It sounds clinical, scientific, but what happened there was systematic torture disguised as research. His stated objective was to develop a resistance index of frostbite, a mathematical formula that could predict how long it would take for human tissue to freeze under different conditions. To do this, he needed to test on actual humans under controlled circumstances. The subjects for his experiments came from the same source as all of Unit 731's victims. Prisoners, Chinese civilians accused of being resistance fighters, Korean laborers arrested on vague charges, Russian prisoners of war, Mongolian villagers in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were brought to Unit 731, given numbers instead of names, and referred to as Maruta logs, raw materials for experimentation. Yoshimura's staff didn't see them as human beings. They were data points. The experiments followed a brutal pattern. Prisoners would be taken outside during the coldest parts of the Manchurian winter. The temperature regularly dropped to -40 or 50 degrees Celsius, cold enough that exposed skin freezes in minutes. Sometimes, prisoners were simply forced to stand outside in the cold, barefoot and with exposed arms, while researchers timed how long it took for frostbite to set in. Other times, their hands or feet were submerged in tubs of water mixed with ice, accelerating the freezing process. Yoshimura meticulously documented everything. He recorded the exact temperature, the humidity, the wind speed, the time of day, whether the prisoner had eaten recently, whether they had exercised beforehand, whether they had been kept awake. Every variable was controlled and measured. He developed detailed charts showing how different factors affected freezing time. He discovered that hunger increased susceptibility to frostbite, that exhaustion made it worse, that the time of day mattered. Hands froze faster in the early morning. Once a limb was frozen, Saladan Yoshimura insisted on waiting until the tissue was completely frozen, not just frostbitten. The real experimentation began. His assistants would test the frozen limbs by striking them with wooden sticks or canes. Multiple testimonies from Unit 731 staff described this horrific detail. The frozen arms and legs made a sound like hitting a plank of wood. That sound became a signal that the tissue was sufficiently frozen for the next phase. Then came the treatment experiments. Yoshimura wanted to know the best way to thaw frozen tissue, but instead of humanitarian concern, his goal was purely practical: how to get frostbitten soldiers back into combat as quickly as possible. He tried every method he could think of. Some prisoners had their frozen limbs plunged into hot water, sometimes as hot as 100 degrees Celsius. The result was catastrophic. The sudden temperature change caused the skin and muscle to literally separate from the bone. Prisoners screamed in agony as their flesh sloughed off. Others had their frozen limbs held over open flames. The tissue would thaw, but it would also burn and char. Yoshimura recorded the damage meticulously. Some prisoners received gradual warming. Their frozen limbs were slowly brought back to room temperature over hours. This was actually the most effective treatment, and Yoshimura documented it carefully. This finding would later be incorporated into medical practice, and some prisoners were given no treatment at all. They were simply left overnight with their frozen limbs to see how long it would take for their own circulation to thaw the tissue. Most of these prisoners died from shock, infection, or but here is what makes Yoshimura's crimes even more disturbing. He didn't just test once and stop. He was methodical, obsessive. He wanted comprehensive data, so he repeated experiments dozens, then hundreds of times, with different variables. He froze women's arms, children's legs. He tested different ages, different body types, different levels of health. He even tested a 3-day-old infant, inserting a needle through the baby's finger to prevent the tiny fist from clenching, then submerging the hand in ice water. Why a 3-day-old baby? Because Yoshimura wanted data on how frostbite affected different developmental stages, the baby didn't survive the experiment. None of them did. Yoshimura's staff later testified that he was known as the most strict and cold-blooded of all the Unit 731 researchers. While other scientists occasionally showed hesitation or discomfort, Yoshimura never did. He approached human suffering with the detachment of someone examining bacteria under a microscope. One testimony described how Yoshimura once filmed 2 naked prisoners in an outdoor pen in -45-degree conditions. He filmed the entire process from the first signs of hypothermia to complete freezing to death. The footage was used as a training film for the Japanese military. Another witness described entering Yoshimura's laboratory and seeing 5 Chinese prisoners sitting on a bench, their arms black with severe frostbite. Up to their elbows, they were waiting, not for treatment for the next phase of the experiment. The answer, he discovered, was that previously frostbitten tissue froze faster. He published this finding years later in a medical journal. By 1945, Yoshimura had conducted frostbite experiments on at least several hundred prisoners. Some estimates put the number at over 1,000. Every single one of them died either during the experiments or were executed afterward to prevent witnesses. What separated Yoshimura from other Unit 731 researchers was on just the brutality of his experiments, it was his scientific rigor. He approached human torture with the methodology of legitimate research, and that made him even more dangerous. He developed what he called the resistance index of frostbite. This was a mathematical formula based on 3 key measurements: the mean skin temperature 5 to 30 minutes after immersion in freezing water, the temperature of the first rise after immersion, and the time until the temperature first began to rise. To calculate this index, he needed extensive data, so he subjected prisoners to hundreds of variations of the same basic experiment. He would test how frostbite resistance changed based on the time of day the freezing occurred, morning versus afternoon versus evening. He discovered that hands froze fastest in the early morning hours. The prisoner's physical state before freezing, whether they had been kept awake all night, whether they had been starved for 24 hours or 48 hours, whether they had just eaten a heavy meal or a hot meal, whether they had just exercised, whether they had just taken a cold bath or a hot bath. The prisoner's diet over the previous 5 days: high protein from animal sources, high protein from vegetable sources, low protein intake. He was testing whether nutrition affected susceptibility to frostbite. The surrounding environmental conditions: temperature, humidity, wind speed, cloud cover, age and gender, children, adults, elderly, men and women. This wasn't random cruelty. This was systematic, methodical documentation of human suffering. Yoshimura was trying to create a comprehensive scientific model of human response to freezing temperatures, and he succeeded. His research produced dozens of papers worth of data, charts showing optimal freezing times, graphs demonstrating treatment effectiveness, formulas predicting frostbite progression, all built on the torture and death of hundreds of human beings. But Yoshimura's work extended beyond just freezing. He also conducted what he called chilling experiments, subjecting hands and fingers to near temperatures using ice water baths just above the freezing point. These experiments were designed to study the effects of prolonged cold exposure without complete tissue freezing. He would immerse prisoners' hands in water cooled to 0 to 2 degrees Celsius and keep them there for extended periods, sometimes hours. He measured blood flow, skin temperature, nerve response, pain tolerance, tissue demand. He recorded exactly how long it took for nerve damage to become permanent, for tissue death to begin, for the body's warming mechanisms to fail. In one particularly horrific experiment, he tested on a group that he later described in his published papers as laboratory workers, students, soldiers, and laborers. That clinical description hid the truth. They were prisoners. The papers also mentioned women, children, and even a 3-day-old baby. Why would he test on a newborn? Because Yoshimura wanted to understand developmental differences in cold tolerance. An infant's circulatory system works differently than an adult's. Their surface area to mass ratio is different. Their ability to generate body heat is different. So, he needed infant data. The 3DL baby was subjected to cold water immersion of its fingers. Yoshimura inserted a needle through the infant's finger knot for medical reasons. but to prevent the natural reflex of the baby's hand curling into a fist, which would have complicated his measurements. The baby Diad Yoshimura recorded the data. This level of calculated cruelty extended to his treatment of old prisoners. There are testimonies from Unit 731 staff describing how Yoshimura would personally oversee experiments, never showing emotion, never acknowledging the prisoner's suffering. He would give instructions in a calm, clinical voice. Submerge for 20 minutes. Apply hot water at 90 degrees. Record temperature every 5 minutes. One witness described seeing Yoshimura observing 2 naked men placed in an outdoor enclosure in minus 45-degree weather. The men were begging for mercy. Yoshimura was filming them with a camera, documenting their deterioration from initial shivering to violent convulsions to the final stage where their bodies simply stopped moving. The entire process took hours. Yoshimura filmed it all. This footage became a training film used by the Japanese military to educate soldiers about the stages of hypothermia. It showed real human beings freezing to death in real time, and it was used as an educational resource. Yoshimura's meticulous documentation meant that his experiments weren't just acts of cruelty. Other researchers could take his methodology and data and continue the work. In fact, he gave lectures about his research. In 1941, while still at Unit 731, he traveled to Kyoto and delivered a lecture at his former university describing his frostbite experiments. He described freezing a prisoner's middle finger and the various treatment methods tested. He presented it as scientific achievement. His audience of medical professionals listened and took notes. Some of them knew or suspected where the data came from. None of them objected. This was the normalization of atrocity. Yoshimura had successfully framed torture as science, murder as research, and human beings as expendable raw materials for data collection. Yoshimura's frostbite research wasn't just academic. It had direct military applications, and the data he generated was immediately put to use by the Japanese Imperial Army. The frostbite treatment protocols developed from his experiments were distributed to Japanese military, medical units throughout China and the Pacific. Field manuals were updated based on his findings. The most effective treatment, he discovered gradual warming rather than rapid. Heating became standard procedure for treating frostbitten soldiers. This created a horrifying paradox. Yoshimura's torture of Chinese civilians helped save Japanese soldiers' lives. The data extracted through unimaginable cruelty was medically valid and useful. That's what made it so ethically devastating. Japanese military commanders praised his work. The Ministry of War considered his frostbite research a major success. He received commendations. His research was classified as vital to the war effort. The Kuomintang Army even produced promotional documentaries featuring his experiments, though. Of course, the documentaries didn't show the prisoners or mention that human test subjects were used. But Yoshimura's contributions to Unit 731 went beyond just frostbite research. His laboratory was part of a larger, integrated system. The prisoners he experimented on often came from the same pool used by other researchers. Someone who survived Yoshimura's frostbite experiments might then be transferred to another laboratory for different types of tests. The body was used until it had no more data to give. Then the prisoner was either executed or died from the accumulated damage. This industrialized approach to human experimentation was one of Unit 731's most horrific characteristics. Prisoners weren't killed quickly, they were used up, piece by piece, experiment by experiment. A woman might be subjected to frostbite testing, then infected with typhus to observe disease progression, then vivisected to study organ damage. All in the name of science. Yoshimura's laboratory processed dozens of prisoners every month. Over his 7 years at Unit 731, hundreds passed through his facility. Not one survived to tell their story. We only know what happened because of testimonies from the perpetrators themselves. After the war, during the 1949 Khabarovsky war crimes trials conducted by the Soviet Union, several Unit 731 members testified about what they had witnessed. One testimony came from Kurokazu Satoru, a sergeant major of the military police at Unit 731. He described walking into Yoshimura's laboratory and seeing 5 Chinese prisoners sitting on a bench. Their arms were frozen solid up to their elbows, completely black with severe frostbite. They were conscious. They were in agony, and Yoshimura was calmly taking measurements, preparing for the next phase of the experiment. Kurokazu testified that this scene haunted him for the rest of his life. He said Yoshimura showed no emotion whatsoever, no hesitation, no remorse. Just clinical observation. Another witness, a former assistant in Yoshimura's lab, described how the team would discuss prisoners as if they were laboratory equipment. This, Maruta's fingers froze. In 80 minutes, that Maruta's tissue degraded faster than expected. The dehumanization was complete, and it wasn't just happening in Yoshimura's lab. Across the entire Unit 731 complex, thousands of prisoners were being subjected to every imaginable form of medical torture. Plague, infections, vivisection, pressure experiments, dehydration, studies, gas testing. Yoshimura's frostbite program was just one small part of a vast machinery of death. But even within that horrific context, Yoshimura stood out. Multiple testimonies describe him as uniquely cold and methodical. Even other Unit 731 researchers, who were themselves committing atrocities, found Yoshimura's detachment unsettling. He never showed any sign of seeing his test subjects as human beings. They were variables in an equation, data points in a study. He had taken the scientific method, humanity's greatest tool for understanding the world, and turned it into an instrument of torture. Behind Yoshimura's data tables and scientific papers were real people, human beings with names, families, lives that were stolen from them. We don't know most of their names. The Japanese military deliberately destroyed prisoner records when Unit 731 was evacuated. But we know they were there. Chinese farmers arrested for resisting Japanese occupation. Korean laborers conscripted for work and then accused of sabotage. Russian prisoners of war captured on the border. Mongolian villagers who lived near Japanese military installations. They were brought to Unit 731 in railway cars, packed together, terrified, with no idea where they were going. When they arrived at Pingfang, they were processed like cargo, stripped of their clothes, their possessions, their identities, given a number, locked in cells in the roadblock. Some were taken to Yoshimura's laboratory on their first day. Others spent weeks or months in the prison, watching as fellow prisoners were taken away and never returned, knowing that eventually their turn would come. When prisoners were selected for Yoshimura's experiments, they were taken outside regardless of whether they wanted to cooperate. There was no consent, no explanation. Guards would simply drag them to the outdoor testing area or to the ice water tubs. Imagine being forced to stand barefoot in minus 40-degree cold. Your feet start burning almost immediately. That's the first stage of frostbite. Then the pain becomes excruciating as ice crystals form in your tissue. Then, horrifyingly, the pain stops as your nerves freeze and die. Your feet turn white, then blue, then black. And the entire time, researchers are standing nearby with clipboards, timing you, taking measurements, discussing your condition in clinical terms, as if you're not even there. One survivor testimony from someone who witnessed but wasn't subjected to these experiments described the sounds. Prisoners screaming, begging. The screams would eventually stop, not because the pain ended, but because hypothermia set in and they lost consciousness. Then there was just the sound of researchers talking quietly, the scratch of pencils on paper, the click of cameras. The dehumanization was systematic. Yoshimura trained his assistants never to make eye contact with prisoners, never to respond to their pleas, to refer to them only by number, to treat them exactly like laboratory rats with less care. Actually, since laboratory animals were valuable and prisoners were abundant, women suffered particularly horrific fates. Female prisoners were used in frostbite experiments, just like men, but they were also vulnerable to sexual violence. One testimony describes a woman who had been used in a frostbite experiment. Her hands were frozen black, being raped by Unit 731 staff members. She couldn't fight back. Her hands were useless. She was in agony from the frostbite, and she was assaulted. This is the reality of what happened at Yoshimura's laboratory. Not sanitized, not clinical. Real human suffering, inflicted deliberately, documented meticulously, and then filed away as data. Children were not spared. The 3-day-old infant that Yoshimura tested on was not an anomaly. Children were regularly used as test subjects because Yoshimura wanted developmental data. A 3-year-old child's circulatory system responds differently to cold than in adults. So, children were frozen. There's a testimony about a mother and child who were brought to Unit 731 together. The mother was used in one experiment. The child was used in another. Neither survived. When the mother's body was taken away for disposal, she was still reaching toward where her child had been. These weren't statistics. They were people. Every number in Yoshimura's data represented someone's final moments of terror and pain. Every graph showing freezing time progression represented a human being losing their life in agony. And Yoshimura never acknowledged any of it. Years after the war, when questioned about his research, he insisted that the experiments were conducted on volunteers, laboratory workers, and soldiers who had consented. This was a lie. His published papers mention women, children, and infants. Volunteers don't include 3-day-old babies. The human cost of Yoshimura's research is incalculable. We know hundreds died in his experiments, but we don't know their names. We don't know their stories. They were erased from history, reduced to data points in scientific papers that would later be published in legitimate medical journals. That's perhaps the cruelest part. These people suffered unimaginable torture, and their deaths weren't even acknowledged. They simply disappeared. Their families never knew what happened to them. There was no funeral, no grave, no memorial. Just ashes in an incinerator and numbers in a logbook that was later burned when Unit 731 was evacuated. August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hido announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. For the prisoners of Unit 731, this should have meant liberation. It meant execution. Shirohei had already given the orders weeks earlier, when it became clear Japan would lose. All prisoners were to be eliminated. All evidence was to be destroyed. The complex was to be demolished. Nothing could be left that would reveal what had happened. In Yoshimura's laboratory, the remaining test subjects, those who had somehow survived the frostbite experiments, were killed. Some were given lethal injections. Others were shot. A few were locked in rooms that were then set on fire. The documentation was more carefully handled. Yoshimura and the other Hisatos were ordered to preserve their data, but destroy anything that explicitly mentioned human experimentation. So they burned prisoner records, photographs of victims, logbooks with names, but they kept their scientific findings, the charts, graphs, formulas, and conclusions. This selective destruction was deliberate. Ishii knew the data would be valuable to whoever occupied Japan next. He was already preparing to negotiate. The Soviet Red Army was advancing rapidly toward Manchuria. On August 9th, they launched a massive invasion. Unit 731 had less than a week to evacuate. The complex was systematically destroyed. Buildings were blown up with dynamite. Laboratories were burned. Even the prison blocks were demolished. Yoshimura, along with most of the senior Unit 731 staff, boarded trains back to Japan. They took their research data with them. They left behind the ruins of their crimes and the bodies of their victims. When Soviet troops arrived at Pingfang on August 19th, they found a scene of devastation: collapsed buildings, charred ruins, and scattered human remains, bodies that hadn't been completely destroyed. Bones in the rubble, mass graves hastily dug and incompletely filled. The Soviets conducted an investigation. They interviewed local Chinese residents who described the facility's operations. They excavated mass graves. They collected evidence, and they began searching for the perpetrators. Some lower-level Unit 731 staff were captured by the Soviets. In 1949, these men were put on trial in Khabarovsk. They testified about what they had witnessed. Their testimonies provided detailed accounts of the experiments, including Yoshimura's frostbite research. But Yoshimura himself was never captured by the Soviets. He was safely back in Japan, under American occupation. And the Americans had different plans. In 1945 and 1946, American military investigators began learning about Unit 731. At first, they were horrified. The reports described atrocities that rivaled anything the Nazis had done. There were calls to prosecute the Unit 731 scientists as war criminals, to include them in the Tokyo trials alongside Japan's military and political leaders. But then the United States government made a calculation. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviet Union was America's new enemy, and Unit 731 had data that the Soviets wanted data on biological warfare, human experimentation, and weapons development. The Americans decided they wanted that data more than they wanted justice. In 1947, Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders and Dr. Norbert Fell, American microbiologists, interviewed Chiro Ishii and other Unit 731 scientists. Ishii made them an offer: complete immunity from prosecution in exchange for full disclosure of all research data. The Americans agreed. In a classified memo to Washington, they explicitly stated that the information obtained from Unit 731 scientists was of such value that it justified granting immunity. They argued that the data could not be obtained through any other means because no Western country could legally conduct such experiments. They were trading justice for data, and Yoshimura was part of that deal. In exchange for his frostbite research hall, the charts, graphs, formulas, and findings built on the torture and murder of hundreds of people, Yoshimura Hisato would never be prosecuted for war crimes. His name would be kept out of the Tokyo trials. He would be allowed to return to normal life, and that's exactly what happened. Yoshimura Hisato returned to Japan a free man. Not only free, honored, respected, successful. He resumed his academic career as if nothing had happened. In 1947, he returned to Kyoto Imperial University, now renamed Kyoto University. He published papers on cold tolerance, thermal regulation, and human adaptation to extreme temperatures. Some of these papers were directly based on his Unit 731 experiments. He simply omitted any mention of where the data came from. In the published versions, his test subjects became anonymous volunteers. The torture became controlled experimental conditions. The murders became data collection. The medical community accepted it. His papers were published in respected journals. They were cited by other researchers. They contributed to the field of environmental physiology, and nobody asked questions. In fact, Yoshimura's career flourished. In 1956, he became a professor at Kyoto Prefectural University of Medicine. In 1961, he was appointed president of that same university. One of the most prestigious positions in Japanese academia. He gave lectures. He mentored students. He served on medical committees. He was consulted by government agencies on public health issues. He was treated as a distinguished elder statesman of Japanese medicine. In 1978, Yoshimura was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun, one of Japan's highest civilian honors, directly from the emperor. The award recognized his contributions to medical science and education. The citation made no mention of Unit 731. It described him as a pioneering researcher in environmental physiology who had advanced human understanding of cold adaptation. He accepted the award. He attended the ceremony. He was photographed, shaking hands with Japanese officials. And nobody mentioned that his research had been built on the torture and murder of hundreds of Chinese, Korean, and Russian prisoners. Meanwhile, the data he provided to the Americans was being used. The U.S. Biological Warfare Program at Fort Detrick in Maryland incorporated Unit 731's findings into their research. American scientists studied Yoshimura's frostbite data. It informed cold weather survival training for U.S. troops. The Korean War broke out in 1950, just 5 years after Unit 731 was destroyed. American soldiers fought in brutal winter conditions in the mountains of Korea. The cold weather protocols they used were based, in part, on research conducted at Unit 731. Research extracted through torture. This created an ethical paradox that continues to haunt medical ethics discussions today. What do you do with scientifically valid data obtained through morally reprehensible means? Do you use it to save lives, or do you reject it on principle? The U.S. military used it. They justified it by saying the crimes had already been committed. Refusing to use the data would undo the suffering, but using it might prevent future suffering. This reasoning is still debated today. But for Yoshimura, there was no such moral dilemma. In interviews conducted in the 1980s, when he was in his 80s, he maintained that his research at Unit 731 had been legitimate scientific work. He claimed that his test subjects had been volunteers. When confronted with evidence that contradicted this, including his own published papers mentioning children and infants, he became evasive. He never admitted wrongdoing. He never expressed remorse. He never acknowledged the humanity of the people he tortured to death. One interviewer asked him directly, "Did you experiment on children?" Yoshimura replied, "I conducted research on human responses to cold temperatures across various age groups." That was his answer. Clinical, detached. As if he were describing laboratory rats. Yoshimura Hisato died on May 8, 1989. At the age of 85, he died of natural causes in a hospital in Kyoto. He was surrounded by family. He had grandchildren. He had lived a full, successful life. He never spent a day in prison. He was never tried for war crimes. He was never held accountable. His obituaries described him as a distinguished professor and pioneering researcher in environmental physiology. They mentioned his academic achievements, his presidency of Kyoto Prefectural University, his Order of the Rising Sun. Some mentioned that he had conducted research for the military during World War II. None of them mentioned the 3-day-old baby, the 5 prisoners with frozen arms, the hundreds of Chinese civilians who died screaming in agony while he took notes, the systematic torture conducted in the name of science. He was buried with honor. His grave is maintained. His legacy in Japanese medical circles is still, in some contexts, positive, and the victims of his experiments remain nameless, forgotten, erased from history. The story of Yoshimura Hisato is not just about one man's crimes. It's about how societies choose what to remember and what to forget, how systems protect perpetrators when it's convenient, how scientific achievement can be used to whitewash atrocity. Yoshimura's career after the war proves that accountability is not inevitable. Justice is not automatic. Sometimes the guilty walk free because their knowledge is valuable, because their allies are powerful, because enough time passes that people stop asking questions. The Japanese government has never officially acknowledged Yoshimura's crimes. There is no memorial to his victims. There has been no apology. The textbooks that mention Unit 731 at all describe it in vague terms. Controversial wartime research. Yoshimura's name rarely appears, even in those limited accounts. This silence is deliberate. It protects the perpetrators and their legacy. It allows them to be remembered as distinguished scientists rather than war criminals. It lets institutions like Kyoto University celebrate their contributions without confronting the atrocities they committed. But silence also erases the victims. When we don't speak the truth about what happened, we deny those hundreds of Chinese, Korean, and Russian prisoners even the dignity of being remembered. They suffered. They died. And then they were forgotten. That's why these stories must be told, not to assign collective guilt, not to fuel hatred, but to ensure that we remember what humans are capable of when they dehumanize others, when they prioritize knowledge over ethics, when they convince themselves that the ends justify the means. Yoshimura believed until his death that he was a patriot and a scientist. He never saw himself as a monster. That is, perhaps, the most frightening lesson of his story. The worst atrocities in history are often committed by people who believe they're redoing important work, who see themselves as serving a greater good, who have convinced themselves that their victims aren't really human. The capacity for cruelty exists in all of us. What prevents it from manifesting is empathy, morale, courage, and accountability. Yoshimura's story shows what happens when all three are absent. This was the story of Yoshimura Hisato, the man who turned human suffering into science, who tortured hundreds to death in the name of research, and who lived a long, successful, honored life without ever being held accountable. His victims deserve to be remembered. Their suffering deserves to be acknowledged, and the truth about what happened at Unit 731 must never be forgotten. If you believe these stories need to be told, leave a like and subscribe to this channel. In the next video, we'll explore another figure from Unit 731, the man who perfected biological weapons by testing plague bombs on entire cities. His name was Masaji Kitano, and what he did makes Yoshimura's crimes look like just the beginning. Thank you for watching.